Is it alright if we close that door? Is this open for the public for a little while?
Yeah,
Okay,
it is.
fine.
It should be passing.
That should be fine.
Okay.
Alright, whenever you're ready, Maria.
Okay. When was the Hawthorne Works plant built?
It opened in 1905. Western Electric had existed since the late 1860s, and initially they were makers of telegraph equipment for Western Union. And then when telephones were invented and introduced in the 1870s, now initially Western Union, which was the biggest telecommunications company in the country at that time, was trying to get into the telephone industry. And but Alexander Graham Bell's patents were held up in the courts, and that left Western Union without a patron. So Bell recognized that Western Electric was a good company, so they switched their manufacturing from telegraph to telephone. And from 1882 onward, Western Electric was closely associated with the Bell system and with manufacturing telephones for AT&T.
What's the history behind Hawthorne Works? What recognizable achievement does it have?
Well, there's a lot of achievements in different areas. Well, by the time it was necessary to build a place like the Hawthorne Works in 1905, Western Electric had grown, and they could see that they would need a lot more space for the growing telephone industry. It was just like it is today, that it was, the hottest products and the leading cutting-edge technology was in telecommunications, and they were the leading company. Their accomplishments are in science and in industrial production and in the way they treated their employees. This was a factory, in a time of heavy industry in America, when most people could look forward to spending most of their life going to work in some factory somewhere and just doing heavy, mind-numbing physical labor for most of their life. That's the way it was. There were a lot of people at the Hawthorne Works as well who had to do work like that. That generally doesn't make people very happy and contented. The Hawthorne Works chose to take a different route. Rather than thinking of their employees simply as another cog in the machine, just one that happened to need food and a paycheck every week, they thought of their workers as full-rounded people who had a life that they wanted to develop, and so they allowed them to build a life from working at the Hawthorne Works. And in the 1920s, what the name Hawthorne often is associated with today in sociology or psychology textbooks is the Hawthorne studies from that era, where Harvard researchers came to the Hawthorne Works and experimented to see what environmental changes, what effects they would have on workers' output and in the workers' attitude. They wanted to see what conditions would increase production. Initially, they just did illumination tests, because the tests were sponsored by General Electric, who wanted to sell more light bulbs. They wanted to see if there was a correlation, if they could state a correlation between more lights and more output. But the strange thing was, when they did the experiments, when they had the control groups with either lower lighting or with no change in lighting, and they were told that there was a change in lighting, they found even with those groups there was a bump up in their production. So that was kind of a head scratcher for these researchers. They just expected a straightforward connection between more lights and more production. So they commissioned further studies where 6 women from one of the assembly rooms who were just putting together relays, a small part of the telephone all day long, were put in the room by themselves, and various conditions in their work environment were changed at various times. Again, they dealt with the lighting, but even temperature, adding work breaks, length of the work day, number of days they're working, giving them snacks during the day, and their behaviors, their conditions were monitored very closely. The conclusions, after 6 years of testing in this room and a number of other tests, their conclusions were that it wasn't any particular change in the environment that was going to make people produce more. It was just the fact that they were being paid attention to. This is the conclusion that these researchers came to. So that has been condensed into the Hawthorne effect that you read about in sociology or psychology, that test subjects, human test subjects, behavior is affected simply by the fact that they know they're being watched. In some cases, it's a matter of trying to please the researcher. But over the years, since then, it's still talked about, it's still argued about. Papers are still published on these studies. Various arguments on different sides of the issues. Others have looked at it again and say the data don't support those conclusions. Others reach different conclusions based on the same data. So basically what it set off, it's very murky science, and what it set off was like a 75-year scholarly pillow fight that's still going on to this day. So did the Hawthorne studies really teach science something? I would say no. But it's a debate. You could debate it in so many aspects about how research is set up, the faulty setup, a faulty construction of an experiment, how it's interpreted, that human interpretation is always a factor, human biases are always a factor in interpreting the outcome of an experiment. And but I would hope that the Hawthorne works is remembered for other things besides that. Apart and separate from the studies, which people may think led to improved conditions at the factory, those conditions already existed at Hawthorne long before the tests, the experiments ever went through. They already had a pension plan from 1906 onward. They had the employees club from the 19-teens onward. They had night school. All those things existed before the Harvard researchers ever came here. So it would be a mistake to conclude that these wise people from the East Coast came in, looked at conditions here and decided, you should treat your people better and give them all these things. They already had that. And they had very little to do with it. Also, I think what Hawthorne should be remembered for is the contributions they made during the Second World War. They turned out more than $2 billion worth of communication equipment here. They built 57,000 radar units, different kinds of radar units that was, cutting edge technology at the time. Top secret technology. I mean, people knew that such a thing as radar existed, but the details of it were not known. But Hawthorne and other factories like it in Chicago were producing all that equipment here that was shipped overseas and worked under a variety of tough conditions, and it was very reliable equipment. And so they made a big contribution to everything from radar to sonar to shipboard communication devices to gun director systems, anti-aircraft gun director systems, all of that stuff. Very sophisticated equipment for its time. And they were fortunate that they were working under those conditions. They made a big contribution to winning the war. Every soldier who came ashore, besides having a rifle and ammunition, they had to have that communications equipment, they had to have that transportation equipment that was being provided by the automakers. During those years in World War II, you couldn't get a new telephone for your house. All the communications factories were turned over to military equipment, just the same way that you couldn't buy a new car in 1942 or 43. They were making Jeeps, trucks, planes, tanks the whole time. So Hawthorne Works was a big part of the war effort. And then afterwards, through the Cold War years and into the space age, they were creating still a lot of military communications equipment for the Army and the Air Force, and then also guidance systems for guided missiles, and then communication systems for NASA during the space program. And to work at Hawthorne in those days, that was very similar to seeking and getting a job at companies like Microsoft and Google and Apple today. This was the leader, Western Electric was the leader in telecommunications technology back then. The company doesn't exist anymore in that name because of the breakup of the Bell system in the 1980s. And I would hope that people don't get the mistaken impression that somehow the Hawthorne Works and Western Electric are gone now because they fell behind the times and they weren't on the cutting edge anymore. They were just restructured. The Hawthorne Works itself became obsolete physically simply because it was old. The structure couldn't be adapted to more modern manufacturing technology. They were a factory that made heavy metal items, and that was no longer the case in an age of wireless technology and transistorized and miniaturized communications equipment. They no longer needed, cable and wire in a wireless age. So the building itself became obsolete, and it had already wound down from 40,000 people until there were just about 4,000 people working there in the early 80s when they announced the closing of the factory. But I think the important legacy should be that here was a partnership between labor and management, that they both understood that they were in it together. In so many other industries where there was that antagonism, the outright warfare in many other industries, in steel and in automobiles and in coal mining, or the other heavy industries of that day, telecommunications and electronics didn't have that same type of conflict simply because they chose to take a different tack. And in many other ways, in many other areas, you'd have that conflict between, the robber baron owners of the company versus the fighting labor activists. That didn't happen in the Hawthorne Works, but their workers came away with every benefit and more that the labor movement was fighting for, because some far-thinking people understood that that was better for all of them in the long run. If there's a dark side, if there's a drawback to it in that age, this was pretty much a white man's dream. The hiring was mostly white in those days, and they kept it that way. That changed in World War II, however, when the executive order mandated non-racial preferences in hiring. That after that point they could hire African Americans. There were about 5 to 10% of the employees were African American after that. Still a better opportunity than many places. But in some ways the Hawthorne Works was a product of its age. In other ways it was way ahead of its age. And unfortunately, when a place is closed and bulldozed and isn't physically visible anymore, people forget about it. And time moves on, and it hasn't even been gone 30 years, but it's pretty much forgotten. So we're hoping that this little bit here with the museum and with recording the histories of the people who worked there while they're still around to get those histories, we can kind of preserve that history and make people think about why there aren't more workplaces like this today. When we look at a new age, when young people who are just coming out of college today, when a college education is pretty much mandatory, then you load up on college debt, you're going to work for a company that doesn't want you to stick around your whole career. Unfortunately, those of you who are in your 20s and younger than that, during the course of your work life, you're going to change jobs 10 or 12 times, and not voluntarily. These are people who walked in as teenagers and walked out as retirees in many cases, with a pension. And I still meet people who get that pension check and they get knee replacements or whatever, courtesy of their Western Electric medical coverage. So it's a different era, and it worked for them. It worked. If anybody says it didn't work, they're wrong, because it sure did.
Who were some of the major figureheads behind Hawthorne Works?
I guess you would say it would be, one of them would be Mr. Albright, who was the first superintendent, and he had a lot to do with the kind of establishing that spirit where the employees were treated well. And but that sort of came from the top of AT&T. Even though, see, again, it's a paradox, because this was the biggest corporation in America, you know, the type of organization that you wouldn't associate with treating people with respect and dignity, but they did. And it came from Theodore Vail, who was the president of AT&T, who was a tough customer, was very competitive as a businessman, who wanted AT&T to dominate the telephone system in the United States, and did everything he could to make that happen. But he also understood that to make that happen, they had to provide a public service, that establishing a nationwide working phone system, seeing that everyone had telephone communications across the country, that was a good thing, that was a social good, and they were performing a public service, and he wanted the whole company to operate that way. And that passed on to Western Electric, which was, you know, wholly owned by AT&T. So they understood that in their workplace and in the way they did business with their customers, it was a public service, and they were all in it together. Now, over the years, you know, Ma Bell became representative of the big company. You know, if your service wasn't so good, well, what were you going to do? You know, and it's not like today when you can go out to the mall and shop around for other phone service. Ma Bell was Ma Bell. You got your phone service. If you lived in Illinois, you got your phone service from Illinois Bell, and that was that. And you didn't own your telephone, you leased it from them in the house. But the good thing about that is that they come in and fix it for free if it breaks. So that was an incentive to them to make very reliable and durable products, and they did.
Hawthorne Works was very large. What amenities did the plant offer employees, and what was the culture like on the plant?
The amenities included everything a city would have, from their own hospital, from a gymnasium and a 10-acre athletic field, baseball diamonds, tennis courts, athletic teams, hobby clubs and social clubs through the Hawthorne Employees Club. I don't know if I mentioned the hospital as well, but medical care on site. But the place had its own power plant, had 11 cafeterias with just 400 food service workers. So everything you could ask for from an employer. Sometimes the word paternalism is attached to that. I don't think it's fair to call it that. I don't think the company was really trying to control anyone's behavior. Once they walked out their gates, they were free to do whatever they wanted to do. They did, you know, Cicero had a lot of, you know, less wholesome activities out there, and they took full advantage of those as well. Just as long as you showed up sober again on Monday morning and got back to work, they were fine with that. But it touched everyone's life in those towns for all of those years. You either worked there yourself, or you were part of a family that somebody had a paycheck from there, or you knew somebody who worked there, or you had an aunt or uncle who did something there, or your company was associated with being a vendor for Western Electric. But at the same time, they didn't seek to dominate the social life in the town. They provided a lot of the services, you know, social services for the town, but as in many other places where companies sought to dominate politically, Western Electric kind of kept its hands off of those things.
Did the commuting to Hawthorne Works change when Route 66 was established in 1926?
Yes, it did, and that coincided, you know, the building of the route coincided with more Americans getting automobiles. And it seemed like a lot of the workforce gravitated south and west, you know, down Ogden Avenue and in that direction. There were also commuter rail lines. There was a Burlington stop right at the south end of the plant. A lot more people commuted in and carpooled in from those years onward. So that enabled a lot of people to move out of Cicero itself and into the southwest suburbs. Of the 40,000 people at its peak who were working there, they were spread out all over the place. They lived in almost all neighborhoods of Chicago. It was maybe 20% of the people, or maybe a bit more than that, were living in Cicero, and another 20% in Berwyn, up until like as late as the 1950s. But yeah, the increase of roads and automobiles in America in general enabled these people to live farther away from work and to move out, and with all the benefits that they accrued from working at Western, they were able to build that suburban lifestyle farther away from the factory and the city.
Why has the Hawthorne Works Tower survived demolished? Are there any plans to renovate it and preserve it?
No, I think now it's owned by the town of Cicero. Initially, it was bought as part of the whole plant when it was bought by a real estate developer in the late 1980s. He decided to keep the tower there. I don't know if he had any specific plans for it. But then when the shop, everything else was torn down, virtually everything else was torn down, the tower stood, the shopping center was built there, and then when the developer, the owner of the property, died in 2009, I believe, at that point the property reverted to ownership by the town of Cicero. Any plans to renovate it? None that I know of. That's all in the hands of the town of Cicero. So if it stands or falls, I mean, you can see it's pretty sturdy. It's not in real good condition, but that's 110 years old, and it still looks good. It was built pretty sturdily.
Why did the plant shut down in the 80s, and what were the causes behind the fall of Western Electric?
I think we kind of touched on that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But can you maybe tell us a little bit about the Hello Charlie competition?
Yeah, that was because of, it was just another one of the social activities in the plant that, much like a small town or a small city, people did everything together, from going to school to going on trips together. The entire plant went on vacation at the same time every year. Last 2 weeks of July, it all closed down. So it was much like a small town. And they also had a beauty contest every year. So from 1930 to 1980, there was a competition to choose the Hello Charlie girl. And that name comes from a story that in the 1920s, there was someone who had a friend or had an acquaintance at the Hawthorne Works named Charlie, and he wanted to send him a card. Couldn't remember his last name, so he just addressed it to Charlie, Hawthorne Works. And of course the Hawthorne Works was so big and famous that they had their own post office substation. And the letter made its way there, and it was passed around, and eventually it found its way to the right Charlie. So the story got out, and from that point on, everyone who worked at Hawthorne was nicknamed Charlie. So when the contest started, they called her the Hello Charlie girl. And then every year, the winner of the Hello Charlie girl contest would have her picture on stickers and bumper stickers and everything, so that when people were traveling around the country, they could spot the other Hello Charlie stickers, and they'd recognize one of their co-workers.
That's awesome. That's so cool.
I love that. Great. Anything else?
I
I think we're good on the questions.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.